18 years. It's an age when life seems like an endless symphony of possibilities, where every new chord promises something grandiose, where time itself is a viscous, warm honey. For Leah Betts, this symphony was cut short on a single, deafeningly false note, turning into the monotonous, soulless beep of a life support machine. Her face, a frozen mask in a coma entangled in tubes and wires, became an icon. Not a symbol of hope or struggle, but a horrifying mass-produced banner of the anti-drug panic of the 90s, a banner on which was written a single word: fear. This photograph was everywhere. It stared down from gigantic billboards looming over morning traffic jams, a silent ghost condemning the hustle of the living. It occupied the front pages of newspapers, displacing politics and economics with its quiet, paralyzing tragedy. It invaded living rooms with the evening news becoming a silent reproach to an entire generation. The message was simple, cruel, and monstrously false. Just one ecstasy pill killed Leah Betts. Millions of parents stared into that swollen, lifeless face and in horror saw their own children in it. In their minds, they pictured dark, sweat-soaked clubs, predatory dealers with empty eyes, and a deadly powder hidden in a bright, candy-like shell. Society demanded blood, and it was given a simple, understandable enemy. But the truth, as is often the case, was far more complex, subtle, and for that reason, even more tragic. Leah died not from toxic shock, not from an overdose, not from a poison that was supposedly in the pill. She died from water intoxication, from hyponatremia. Scared to death by stories about dehydration at raves, she followed the safe advice. She drank 7 liters of water in 90 minutes. Her blood turned to water, her cells swelled, and her brain literally drowned inside her own skull. The substance she took was merely a catalyst, a trigger for a chain of tragic coincidences, ignorance, and panic. It was not the executioner, but this detail was conveniently omitted. The story became too good, too useful for propaganda, to be spoiled by the facts. But how did this become possible at all? It was a paradox that no one wanted to notice. A molecule that psychotherapists in the quiet of their offices called Adam, for its almost biblical ability to return a person to a state of pristine innocence and empathy. A chemical compound that millions of people around the world knew as an empathogen, or the love drug. How did it become synonymous with faceless death in the eyes of the entire world? The story of MDMA is not just the story of a drug, it is a story of fear, hope, and humanity's desperate, eternal search for connection. Connection with oneself, with one's past, with other people. It is the tale of how a scientific discovery, full of incredible therapeutic potential, was first forgotten, then stolen, criminalized, and turned into a media monster. But to understand this madness, we must go back to the very beginning, to the silence of the laboratory where it all began. 1912, Darmstadt, Germany. A city of orderly streets, precise minds, and the industrial grandeur of the Kaiser's empire. Here, in the sparkling, clean, light-flooded laboratories of the pharmaceutical giant Merck, a chemist named Anton Köllisch was conducting what seemed to be a completely routine investigation. He was not seeking enlightenment. He was not trying to crack the code of consciousness or open the doors of perception. His task was far more prosaic, more down to earth. The Imperial German army, anxiously gazing into the approaching storm of the First Mechanized War, was searching for any way to save its soldiers from blood loss on the battlefield. Köllisch was tasked with synthesizing a hemostatic agent, a compound capable of quickly stopping blood. He methodically worked with derivatives of safrole, a substance obtained from sassafras oil, which in those years was used for everything, from flavoring root beer to creating complex perfume compositions. But this was just the tip of the iceberg of his painstaking research, the peak of a pyramid of hundreds of failed attempts. On December 24, 1912, on Christmas Eve, after a series of careful chemical reactions, Köllisch created a new, previously unknown molecule. In the dry, emotionless nomenclature of organic chemistry, it was given the cumbersome name 3,4-methylenedioxymethamphetamine, an ironic, unintentional Christmas gift to a world that had no idea what Pandora's box it had just received. Merck, following its standard procedure, immediately filed a patent application. Not because it saw a scientific or commercial revolution in this compound, but because such was the corporate strategy. Pharmaceutical giants patented everything they could get their hands on, creating vast libraries of molecules that might one day, perhaps, prove useful. Patent number 217.350 described the synthesis process with scrupulous German precision. Every stage, every reagent, every temperature was recorded, but it contained not a single word about what this substance does to a living organism. No human trials, no animal studies, no speculation about its properties. What they had created was, for them, nothing more than another line in a lab journal. It was simply recorded, catalogued, and buried in the depths of the corporate archives. A chemical orphan sleeping on the dusty pages of a German patent file. MDMA was born and was immediately forgotten, deemed an unpromising byproduct. They did not yet know that they had created not a medicine, but a key to a completely different world. The world moved on, not noticing this quiet birth. The Great War came and went, grinding up an entire generation in its trenches and changing the map of Europe beyond recognition. The Roaring Twenties brought with them their own intoxicants, tart gin, and the feverish rhythms of jazz. The Great Depression turned world economies to dust. The Second World War, even more terrible and all-consuming than the first, engulfed the planet in fire. And all this time, MDMA remained in its paper prison, unknown and unresearched. Köllisch's compound had shown no promise either as a blood-clotting agent or as anything else that could be considered commercially useful. It was a molecular dead end, one of thousands of failed attempts. But in the world of chemistry and pharmacology, nothing stays buried forever. The post-war era gave rise to a completely new type of scientist, funded by new kinds of money and asking entirely new, uncomfortable questions. The Cold War was not just a military and political contest between two superpowers, it was psychological. The human mind, with all its vulnerability, plasticity, and hidden potential, suddenly became a new, invisible battlefield. And on this battlefield, there were no rules. In the 1950s, American military and intelligence services, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency, became deeply, almost obsessively interested in so-called behavior modification. The Korean War had generated a flood of alarming reports about American prisoners of war who had allegedly been brainwashed by their communist captors into returning home, spouting Marxist ideology. These reports, whether accurate or wildly exaggerated, struck indescribable terror into the entire intelligence community. The very idea that the enemy might have developed methods for total mind control was unbearable. America needed the same capability, or, even better, an effective countermeasure. This paranoia, fueled by nuclear anxiety, gave birth to one of the darkest and most shameful chapters in the history of American science, Project MK Ultra. MK Ultra was not a single study. It was a giant umbrella program encompassing hundreds of secret, unethical experiments conducted on unsuspecting American citizens, prison inmates, mental hospital patients, prostitutes, and even CIA employees themselves who had substances slipped into their morning coffee. The goal was cynically simple: to find or create drugs and psychological techniques that could be used in interrogations to break a subject's will, extract information, or create absolutely obedient, controllable agents. They were searching for a weapon that struck not the body, but the soul. CIA researchers, operating through a complex network of front foundations, universities, and private contractors to ensure plausible deniability, tested an astonishing arsenal of substances. They tested everything: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, barbiturates, amphetamines, and dozens of little-known exotic synthetic compounds. It was in this sinister context that MDMA was retrieved from archival oblivion for a second time. The exact circumstances remain murky, hidden under a top-secret classification. Many key documents were hastily and illegally destroyed in the 1970s, right before congressional investigators were due to access them. But we do know that in 1953 and 1954, the US Army conducted a series of toxicity studies on MDMA at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, the nation's main center for chemical and biological warfare research. The tests were conducted on animals, hundreds of rats, dozens of dogs and monkeys. The Army researchers, of course, were not at all interested in any possible emotional or empathetic effects. They were looking for a weapon, something that could incapacitate, compel truth, or simply kill. They were looking for a weakness, a vulnerability, a way to break a person. The results were recorded in dry, lifeless clinical language. The compound showed relatively low toxicity at moderate doses, caused some behavioral changes in the test animals, but demonstrated nothing to indicate its potential utility as a truth serum or incapacitating agent. It was not reliable enough. And again, MDMA was considered uninteresting and unpromising. The reports were neatly filed, stamped secret, and once again put on a shelf to gather dust for decades. The molecule had been discovered twice and twice rejected. It took a third discovery, made by a man who was interested not in war or espionage, but in the human soul itself, to finally reveal the true, stunning nature of this substance. They thought they controlled everything, but they made a fatal mistake, underestimating the power of human curiosity. Alexander Sasha Shulgin was not a typical chemist. He was born in 1925 in Berkeley, California, to a family of Russian immigrants who had fled the flames of the Bolshevik Revolution. He served in the Navy during World War II, and then, upon returning home, dove headfirst into science, earning a doctorate in biochemistry from the University of California. Taking a job at the giant chemical company Dow Chemical, he quickly made a name for himself by developing Zectrin, a new, incredibly effective and commercially successful biodegradable insecticide. This invention earned Dow millions of dollars, and as a sign of gratitude, they granted Shulgin something almost unheard of in the world of corporate research: complete, absolute freedom. He could pursue any topic that interested him with minimal oversight and nearly unlimited access to resources. It was a golden cage, and for a time it suited him perfectly. He was the king of his own little chemical kingdom. But in the late 1950s, Shulgin's interests took a sharp turn inward. For the first time in his life, he tried mescaline, the psychoactive alkaloid found in the peyote cactus. The experience, in his own words, was absolutely transformative. He described it as opening a door in the mind that I did not know existed, behind which lay a landscape of consciousness filled with the deepest meaning. He became convinced that psychoactive compounds were not just drugs in a recreational or medical sense. They were tools, technologies for exploring the deepest and most uncharted corners of the human psyche. This idea would become his life's work, but he did not yet know the price he would have to pay for it. In the late 1960s, he left Dow, tired of corporate politics, and set up a small private laboratory right behind his house in the scenic hills of Lafayette, California. Shulgin was a rare creature, a brilliant synthetic chemist with the soul of a mystic, a man who could assemble the most complex molecules with absolute precision, and yet was deeply interested in their subjective, phenomenological effects. He held a special DEA Schedule I license, which legally allowed him to synthesize and research controlled substances for scientific purposes. This license, obtained largely because he consulted for law enforcement agencies, helping them identify new street drugs, gave him both cover and credibility in the eyes of the authorities. He and his wife Anne, a talented psychotherapist with an equally deep interest in altered states of consciousness, worked as a single unit. Sasha would synthesize a new compound in the laboratory, one never before tried by humans. Then, with utmost caution and observing all safety measures, they would take it themselves, starting with microscopic doses. They scrupulously documented everything: the dosage, onset time, duration, subjective effects, from the subtlest shifts in perception to profound insights or, conversely, unpleasant physical discomfort. They enlisted a small, carefully selected circle of trusted friends, psychologists, artists, scientists, whom Shulgin called his research group, to compile as objective a map as possible of the new compound's effects. This practice would undoubtedly horrify modern ethics committees and regulatory bodies, but in the free-thinking atmosphere of early 1970s California, it was Shulgin's method, and it worked. They were pioneers, cartographers of inner space, but others would soon try to burn their maps. Shulgin was not the first to re-synthesize MDMA after Köllisch, but he became its foremost researcher and champion. He stumbled upon vague mentions of the compound in an old Merck patent and in partially declassified army reports from the 50s. Intrigued by its structural similarity to other amphetamines and psychedelics with which he was already well acquainted, Shulgin synthesized the purest MDMA in his laboratory in 1976. But he was in no hurry to try it. He was methodical and cautious. When he finally, after much deliberation, took the first, carefully measured dose, what he discovered stunned him. MDMA was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was not a classic psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin. There were no intense visual hallucinations, no frightening dissolution of the ego into cosmic unity, no sensation of encountering an incomprehensible extraterrestrial intelligence. Instead, MDMA induced something far more subtle, intimate, and, in Shulgin's opinion, immeasurably more valuable. It created a state of profound, crystal-clear, emotional openness and empathy. Anxiety, that eternal background noise of the modern person, simply dissolved. The protective psychological barriers that we build up over years softened and fell away like dry leaves. People felt a deep, warm connection with themselves and with those around them. Past traumas, memories that were too painful for sober analysis, could be examined without all-consuming fear or paralyzing pain. For a few hours, the compound seemed to turn down the volume on the amygdala, the brain's fear center, while simultaneously turning the dials of emotional warmth and introspective capacity to maximum. Shulgin found the perfect metaphor for this: He did not yet understand that he had found not just a tool, but the future battleground for the soul of psychiatry. He called it the window. If classic psychedelics like LSD were like explosively opening a door into a completely foreign, alien landscape of consciousness, then MDMA was like quietly opening a window in one's own long familiar room. It didn't transport you to another world, but it allowed fresh air and sunlight to enter, letting you see familiar things, your own soul, your fears and hopes, clearly, distinctly, and most importantly, with compassion rather than judgment. Seeing this potential, he began to carefully, almost secretly, share it with select psychotherapists whom he knew and trusted implicitly. This was not recreational distribution. It was a desperate attempt to introduce into practice a tool that he deeply believed could bring about a true revolution in psychotherapy. One of the therapists who embraced MDMA with a special, almost religious enthusiasm was a man named Leo Zeff, a semi-retired psychologist from Oakland, resembling a kind bear with a full white beard and gentle manners. In the 1960s, Zeff had been one of the pioneers trained in the use of LSD in psychotherapy before it was banned and demonized. When that door closed, he reluctantly went into retirement. But when Shulgin introduced him to MDMA in 1977, Zeff saw a second chance, a gift from above. He gave MDMA its own code name, Adam, alluding to the biblical character's state of primordial innocence before the fall, to a state of pure openness to the world, not yet poisoned by shame and fear. Leo Zeff became a true missionary for MDMA-assisted therapy. Over the next few years, he secretly traveled throughout America and Europe, personally training hundreds of therapists in the careful, ethical use of MDMA as a powerful therapeutic adjunct. These were not charlatans, but licensed psychologists, psychiatrists and counselors, serious professionals who saw MDMA not as a party drug, but as a unique medicine for the soul. They were building their fragile paradise in the shadows, but they did not realize they had already been noticed. The protocol was incredibly strict and well thought out. It included careful selection and screening of patients, several preparatory sessions to establish goals and intentions, the administration of a single moderate dose of chemically pure MDMA in a completely safe, comfortable setting, a multi-hour therapeutic conversation while the substance was active, and, critically, subsequent integration sessions to process and anchor the experience in daily life. The reports that Shulgin and Zeff received were astonishing. Therapists described incredible breakthroughs in patients who had been at a therapeutic impasse for years. Vietnam veterans with severe PTSD who could finally speak about their trauma without being paralyzed by terror. Couples on the verge of divorce who suddenly regained the ability to hear each other, to feel empathy and forgiveness. People suffering from deep-rooted shame or self-hatred who, for a few magical hours, experienced genuine, unconditional compassion for themselves. It wasn't a magic panacea that solved all problems. The therapeutic work still had to be done. Insights had to be integrated into real life. But MDMA seemed to open that very door, making possible in a few hours the kind of progress that would have taken months, if not years, of painful effort in conventional talk therapy. For a brief shining moment in the late 70s and early 80s, a whole underground network of MDMA therapy existed, operating in a legal grey area. MDMA had not yet been scheduled as a controlled substance. Shulgin, Zeff, and their growing network of like-minded individuals genuinely believed they were pioneering a new, humane era in psychiatry. They were careful, or so they thought. But the world is always bigger than a quiet therapist's office, and rumors were already leaking out, extending beyond this closed, trusting community. In the very early 1980s, MDMA began to inexorably leak from the quiet therapy offices into the loud, hedonistic world of nightlife. Exactly how this happened is still a matter of fierce debate. Most likely, it was a mix of factors. Less discreet therapists, overly enthusiastic patients who shared their transformative experiences with friends, and of course, enterprising individuals who immediately saw immense commercial potential in the new legal substance. One thing is certain. By 1983-1984, MDMA had made a triumphant appearance on the club scene, and, strangely enough, the epicenter of this explosion was Dallas, Texas. A group of young entrepreneurs, among whom a man named Michael Clegg stood out, saw a gold mine. They set up production and began distributing MDMA under a new, shiny brand name, Ecstasy. The choice of name was an act of pure marketing genius. It didn't hint at therapy or introspection. It promised pure, unadulterated pleasure, transcendence, a superb, unforgettable experience. Clegg and his partners were not like stereotypical street-level drug dealers. They were new-wave businessmen. They sold ecstasy almost openly in bars and nightclubs, promoting it as a fashionable and, most importantly, legal high. Since the substance was still in a legal space, there was no need for the clandestine hand-to-hand transactions typical of the cocaine or heroin trade. You could walk up to a bar and buy a tablet of ecstasy as easily as you bought a glass of wine. It was advertised with bright flyers and by word of mouth as the love drug that would make you feel euphoric, deeply connected to the music and the people around you. The Dallas nightlife scene literally exploded. Clubs that had been empty just yesterday now had lines wrapping around the block. People who had never been interested in illegal drugs, lawyers, doctors, stockbrokers, prestigious college students, all wanted to try the fashionable ecstasy. They took it, danced for hours on end, hugged complete strangers, had deep, heartfelt conversations, and woke up the next day with a distinct feeling of having experienced something important and profound. It was the recreational use of a therapeutic tool. And while some in Shulgin's circle were horrified by such a profanation, others were more optimistic, believing that even recreational users benefited from the empathy and openness the substance provided. But this short golden age was coming to its crushing, inevitable end. The growing popularity of ecstasy, its open sale, and the increasingly close, sensational interest from the media attracted the attention of the one organization that Shulgin and his fellow therapists feared most. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the famous DEA, had long been watching. In the early 1980s, as MDMA spread from narrow therapeutic circles to bustling nightclubs, reports from informants and local police departments began to flow into the DEA's analytical center in Washington. Police in Dallas, Austin, and then New York noted the emergence of a new, popular drug being sold almost openly. The media, always hungry for a new drug panic, began publishing loud, alarmist articles about the yuppie psychedelic and the party drug. By 1984, the agency had decided it had seen enough. In July of that year, Senator Lloyd Bentsen of Texas, supposedly in response to numerous complaints from concerned constituents, wrote an official letter to the DEA demanding immediate and decisive action. The agency did not need much convincing. On July 27, 1984, the DEA officially announced its intention to place MDMA on Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act, using a special emergency scheduling procedure. Schedule I is the most restrictive, punitive category reserved for substances that the government considers to have a high potential for abuse, a complete lack of accepted medical use, and insufficient safety, even for use under strict medical supervision. This is the same category that includes heroin, LSD, and marijuana. This announcement had the effect of a bombshell in the small and secretive therapeutic community. Dozens of therapists who had been quietly and successfully using MDMA in their practice for years suddenly faced an existential crisis. Their work, their calling, was about to become a federal crime. Many of them, risking everything, decided to come out of the shadows and fight. A young psychiatrist named Rick Doblin, who had not only personally experienced the profound benefits of MDMA-assisted therapy, but also had a background in public policy, founded an organization called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, created with the sole purpose of challenging the DEA's decision in court. Together with a group of researchers, therapists and lawyers, Doblin argued that the DEA was acting hastily and with prejudice, completely ignoring the growing body of evidence for MDMA's therapeutic potential, and demanded that it be placed in the less restrictive Schedule III, which would allow for continued medical research and legal therapeutic use. But their battle was doomed from the start because they were not fighting against facts, but against ideology. By law, the DEA was obligated to hold administrative hearings. Over several months in 1985, the two sides presented their arguments before the DEA's chief administrative law judge, Francis Young. The therapeutic community, led by Doblin, presented the court with live witnesses, therapists who, under oath, described the astonishing positive results they had observed in their patients. They submitted written case histories, though many details had to be anonymized to protect confidentiality. They argued that MDMA has a low potential for abuse when used in controlled settings, and that a total ban would halt vital, promising research and deprive thousands of patients of a valuable treatment option. The DEA, for its part, presented evidence of recreational use, reports of rare emergency room visits, and testimony from toxicologists about MDMA's structural similarity to other amphetamines. They asserted that the government had a duty to protect the public from any potential threat. Judge Francis Young, after carefully reviewing all the evidence presented, issued a truly astonishing, unprecedented ruling. In May 1986, he officially recommended placing MDMA in Schedule III, not Schedule Y. In his detailed, multi-page opinion, he wrote that the evidence of therapeutic use was credible and convincing, that the compound did not have the high potential for abuse characteristic of Schedule I drugs, and that there was no evidence of significant physical or psychological harm when used in controlled therapeutic contexts. It was a resounding victory for Doblin, Shulgin, and the entire therapeutic community. A rare instance of a high-ranking government official, a member of the law enforcement system, openly acknowledging the potential value of a psychoactive substance, going against the party line. But it was a short-lived, ephemeral victory. The fact is, the DEA is not, by its own charter, obligated to follow the recommendations of its own administrative law judges. The final decision rested with the head, the DEA administrator, and in a completely unprecedented move, the agency publicly and entirely rejected Judge Young's detailed recommendation. On March 23, 1988, despite all the legal and scientific arguments presented, the DEA permanently placed MDMA in Schedule Y. The official explanation, as always, cited vague concerns about neurotoxicity and abuse potential, although it was obvious to most observers that this was a purely political decision dictated by the relentless war on drugs mentality that prevailed in the Reagan era. The therapeutic community was devastated, crushed. Overnight, the use of MDMA in therapy went from a grey area to a federal felony. Therapists who had pioneered this delicate work were forced to immediately cease their practice under threat of lengthy prosecution, the loss of their medical licenses, and actual prison time. All scientific research ground to a halt for decades. Shulgin, who had been so careful, so methodical, so committed to the scientific approach, saw his life's work crudely criminalized and demonized. The window to the soul, which he had so painstakingly discovered and cracked open, was officially boarded up and bolted shut. But this DEA decision had a huge, unintended consequence that would define the next 3 decades of MDMA's tumultuous history. By banning the drug completely and pushing it onto the black market, they guaranteed that MDMA would no longer be the domain of careful therapists administering measured doses in safe offices. From now on, it would become the province of underground chemists, international smugglers, and a new global subculture that was, at that very moment, beginning to form around a revolutionary new form of music and a new kind of collective experience. The government had slammed the therapeutic window shut, but in doing so, it threw the doors of the club wide open. To understand how ecstasy became the defining, iconic drug of a generation, you first have to understand what a rave was. A rave wasn't just a party. It was a powerful cultural phenomenon, a youth movement, a collective rejection of the cynical mainstream and a passionate embrace of something entirely new that, to its participants, felt like a real glimpse of utopia. This story begins in the mid-1980s in the post-industrial cities of America and Europe, places where the old manufacturing economy had collapsed, leaving behind the rusting hulks of factories, giant empty warehouses, and a whole generation of young people with very dim economic prospects but boundless creative energy. In Chicago, black DJs were creating a new, pulsating form of electronic dance music called house. In Detroit, techno was being born, a harder, colder, more mechanistic sound that reflected the industrial decline of the Motor City. In the UK, especially in Manchester and London, acid house emerged, a hypnotic, psychedelic, repetitive style perfectly suited for long, endless nights of dancing. The music was one element, but the setting was another, equally important one. Early raves were illegal, unlicensed parties held in spaces that were never intended for such mass gatherings. Empty warehouses on the outskirts of town, abandoned aircraft hangars, open fields far from the city, deserted industrial sites. The locations were kept top secret, with information spread by word of mouth or through cryptic, coded flyers, and the exact address revealed by phone at the very last minute. And this was no accident. The illegality itself was a huge part of the appeal. Raves existed outside the normal structures of society, beyond the control of the authorities, beyond the judgmental eyes of the mainstream. They were temporary autonomous zones, utopian bubbles where, for one night, a completely different set of rules applied. And it was here, in this melting pot, that ecstasy found its perfect home. The drug and rave culture grew together, intertwining and reinforcing each other in a perfect symbiosis. MDMA was the perfect chemical companion for the rave experience. The music, with its monotonous, shamanic beats, its slow build-ups and explosive drops, its multi-layered sonic texture, became deeply moving, almost physically palpable under the influence of MDMA. The sensory experience was immensely amplified. A simple touch on the shoulder felt like an electric shock. Streams of light and laser beams in the smoke created mesmerizing, kaleidoscopic patterns. But far more important than simple sensory enhancement, MDMA provided the very emotional glue that held the entire rave culture together. Ecstasy dissolved social barriers and fears. At a rave, the hierarchies of the outside world, social class, race, education, background, simply ceased to exist. Strangers became best friends for a night. The competitive, atomized, individualistic ethos of capitalist daily life was replaced, at least for a few hours, by an all-encompassing feeling of collective joy and unity. This utopia was fragile and temporary, but for thousands of young people, it was more real than their everyday lives. People spoke of the vibe, a common, shared emotional state that seemed to envelop the entire crowd like a warm blanket. It was a feeling of belonging, a sense of being part of something much bigger than one's small self. For young people who felt alienated and misunderstood in the world of late 20th century materialism and cynicism, the rave offered an alternative, hopeful vision, a community based on love, acceptance, and a shared ecstatic experience. The phrase peace, love, unity, respect, often abbreviated to PLUR, peace, love, unity, respect, became the unofficial but sacred motto of rave culture. And this was said with absolute sincerity, almost naively. Ravers genuinely believed that in these dark, booming warehouses they were creating a prototype for a new, better society. One that rejected violence, embraced diversity, and placed collective happiness above individual gain. And for many, at least during those long nights soaked in sweat and music, this seemed to be the absolute truth. The culture spread like wildfire. From Great Britain, where the legendary Second Summer of Love in 1988-89 was marked by massive open-air raves attracting tens of thousands of people, it spread to continental Europe, where the techno scene in Berlin after the fall of the wall became a symbol of freedom and unification, and from there to the United States, where rave culture took deep root in New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. By the mid-1990s, raves had become a global phenomenon, and ecstasy was everywhere. But the drug sold at these raves was no longer the pure, precisely dosed substance that Sasha Shulgin had synthesized in his laboratory, or that the therapeutic community had cautiously administered to its patients. The black market had completely taken over, and with it came all the ugly problems of total prohibition. MDMA production went deep underground and moved abroad. Underground, self-taught chemists were not pharmaceutical-grade manufacturers with quality control departments. Control was inconsistent at best, and at worst, completely absent. Pills sold on the street as ecstasy could contain pure MDMA, or they could contain a dangerous cocktail of other, cheaper, and dirtier substances. MDA, a close relative of MDMA but more neurotoxic, methamphetamine, caffeine, ephedrine, or any number of new, unstudied research chemicals and fillers like talcum powder. Some pills contained no MDMA at all, being simply pressed caffeine. The famous logos on the pills, the Mitsubishi Triple Diamonds, the Rolex crown, the cheerful smiley face, were no longer any guarantee of quality. It was just recognizable branding that any underground organization with a cheap pill press could easily copy. This rampant adulteration created real, deadly dangers, but it deterred few people, and no one knew what exactly they were buying in the dark corner of a warehouse, thundering with bass. Governments around the world predictably reacted with panic and repression. In the United Kingdom, the infamous Criminal Justice and Public Order Act was passed in 1994, specifically aimed at combating raves and giving the police broad new powers to break up any unlicensed gatherings. In the US, the so-called Rave Act was passed in 2003, which allowed for the criminal prosecution of club and venue owners if drug use occurred on their premises. This effectively made it legally perilous to hold any large-scale electronic music events. These draconian laws either drove rave culture deeper underground or forced it to become fully commercialized, moving into legal, licensed superclubs and festivals where it could be easily controlled and monetized. The media, meanwhile, gleefully engaged in its usual cycle of fueling moral panic. Every tragic death, even remotely related to ecstasy use, became a headline for days. And there were indeed deaths. Statistically few compared to the millions of people using the drug, but each one was an irreparable tragedy. It is important to understand that most of them were caused not by the inherent toxicity of MDMA itself, but by a combination of external factors, fatal dehydration and overheating from hours of dancing in hot, crowded venues without access to water. Hyponatremia, water intoxication, as in the case of Leah Betts, adulterated pills containing other, more dangerous substances, or pre-existing heart conditions. The campaign surrounding Leah Betts's death ignored the full complexity of her passing, the role of water intoxication, and certainly didn't ask why millions of young people were using ecstasy and not dying. It was a primitive but very effective form of fear-mongering. What was completely lost in this deafening noise of moral panic and police repression was any serious science-based public health approach to harm reduction. Small volunteer organizations like DanceSafe in the US and The Loop in the UK desperately tried to fill this vacuum. They offered anonymous pill testing services right at festivals, distributed information on safe use, and advocated for basic, practical measures like universal access to free water and the availability of special chill-out zones, but they operated in a perilous legal grey area, often facing fierce opposition from authorities who genuinely believed that any harm reduction measure sent the wrong message to society, implicitly condoning drug use. By the end of the 1990s, the original underground rave culture was fragmenting. The utopian idealism of the early raves was diluted by commercialization and exhausted by the endless war with law enforcement. The PLR motto became more like a marketing slogan on a t-shirt than a living shared ethos. But the demand didn't go away. It didn't diminish. If anything, it only grew. And where there is demand, there will always be supply, no matter how illegal, dangerous, or adulterated the final product may be. While ravers danced and law enforcement conducted raids, another, quieter, but no less fierce battle was being waged in the silence of laboratories and on the pages of academic journals. The question at its core was deceptively simple. Is MDMA really dangerous for the brain? The answer, as it turned out, was much more complex than either opposing side wanted to admit. After MDMA was placed on Schedule BY in 1988, any research on humans became extremely difficult. A substances schedule. I classification means the government has officially declared it has no medical value, which creates an absurd bureaucratic and financial catch-22. To prove medical value, one needs to conduct research. But to get permission to research a Schedule I substance, one must navigate an unimaginable labyrinth of regulatory approvals, safety requirements, and funding restrictions. For an entire decade, human research on MDMA was effectively frozen solid. The few studies that were conducted in the 1990s and early 2000s focused mainly on one aspect: toxicity. Specifically neurotoxicity, the potential for MDMA to cause long-term, irreversible brain damage. This concern was not unfounded. The very mechanism of MDMA's action made such a possibility plausible. The drug works by causing a massive, avalanche-like release of serotonin, a neurotransmitter that plays a key role in regulating mood, sleep, appetite, and empathy. This sudden flood of serotonin is what creates those very feelings of euphoria and emotional openness. But everything has a price. The nerve cells that produce and release serotonin can be depleted and even damaged by this unnaturally powerful process. Animal studies, mostly on rats and primates, showed that high or frequently repeated doses of MDMA could indeed cause degeneration of serotonin nerve endings, the finest axonal fibers. The damage appeared to be dose-dependent and most troublingly long-lasting. These studies were truly frightening, and their results were widely covered in the media. The message from the anti-drug establishment was crystal clear and simple. Ecstasy causes irreversible brain damage. A single dose could permanently destroy your serotonin system, which would inevitably lead to chronic depression, memory loss, and early dementia. This became the official, canonical version, repeated in school curricula, in public service announcements, and in congressional hearings. This is your brain on ecstasy. But the real story, as always, was far from being so simple. And as more and higher quality studies accumulated, a much more nuanced and complex picture began to emerge, one that was completely obscured by this primitive rhetoric about holes in the brain. They had created a monster, but now science was beginning to doubt if it was real. First, there was the huge problem of dosage. In early animal studies, the doses of MDMA used when adjusted for body weight were tens of times higher than those typically consumed by humans for recreational purposes. A rat might be intravenously administered the equivalent of a human taking 10, 20, or even 30 pills in a single evening. These were completely unrealistic usage models designed to find toxicity rather than to simulate real-world experience. When later researchers began using doses closer to actual human consumption, the neurotoxic effects were much less pronounced and often proved to be reversible. Second, there was the problem of interspecies differences. It turned out that rats metabolize MDMA completely differently than humans and are much more susceptible to hypothermia, overheating, which is itself a potent neurotoxin. Primates, in turn, seemed more resilient, while humans, based on limited data, were somewhere in between. Third, and this is the most shameful episode in this entire scientific saga, one of the most influential and cited studies claiming severe neurotoxicity in primates turned out to be based on a catastrophic, almost unthinkable error. In 2002, Dr. George Ricourt of the prestigious Johns Hopkins University published an article in the world's leading scientific journal, Science, which claimed that even a single, normal recreational dose of MDMA caused severe and irreversible damage to dopamine neurons, the very brain cells that degenerate in Parkinson's disease. The implications of this claim were terrifying, and the study instantly became a trump card in the hands of anti-drug crusaders. There was just one problem. Ricourt's lab had made a gross error. The vials they thought contained MDMA had, in fact, been mistakenly filled with pure methamphetamine, a completely different drug which is known for its high neurotoxicity to dopamine neurons. When the error was discovered a year later, the paper was scandalously retracted, but the damage to MDMA's reputation had already been done, and the retraction, as is often the case, was heard by few. Human studies, when they were finally permitted and conducted in the 2000s, painted an even more complex picture. Chronic, heavy ecstasy users, people who had taken hundreds, if not thousands of pills over many years, did indeed show some statistically significant differences in brain scans and cognitive tests compared to those who had never used. They had lower serotonin transporter density, a marker of serotonin neuron health, and they performed slightly worse on certain verbal memory tests. But even here, the effects were very subtle, far from as dramatic as the brain damage rhetoric suggested, and it was nearly impossible to separate the effects of MDMA itself from the effects of polydrug use, as almost all heavy ecstasy users also actively use cannabis, alcohol, cocaine, and other substances. Moderate users, who took ecstasy only occasionally, showed virtually no detectable differences from the non-user control group. It seemed that the entire construct of moral panic was built on sand, but to admit this was tantamount to political suicide. But perhaps the most important and most tragic discovery was that the real documented dangers of MDMA, when they did arise, almost always stemmed not from the pure substance itself, but from the context of its use, and most importantly, from the consequences of its total prohibition. Ecstasy deaths were and remain extremely rare, and when they did occur, they were almost always caused by hypothermia and dehydration, easily prevented by access to water and cool-down rooms. Hyponatremia from excessive water consumption, previously undiagnosed heart conditions, or, most frequently, adulterated pills containing dangerous and unpredictable combinations of other, cheaper and more toxic drugs. The actual lethal dose, LD50 of pure MDMA in humans, is quite high compared to standard recreational doses. Prohibition did not make the world safer. It simply made it darker, more dangerous, and far more unpredictable. This story is not over. It is being written right now, at this very moment. In sterile laboratories where scientists, having finally received long-awaited approval, are rediscovering and proving the immense therapeutic potential of MDMA for treating veterans with severe post-traumatic stress disorder. In echoing dark clubs where a new generation of young people still seeks connection and unity in the deafening roar of electronic music. In courtrooms and politicians' offices where the eternal struggle continues between the blind ideology of total prohibition and the scientific pragmatism of harm reduction. And in the very depths of the human consciousness which, despite everything, is still desperately searching for that very window, not a door kicked off its hinges, to look at itself with compassion and without judgment. The story of Leah Betts was a lie, but that lie created a reality in which the truth is still fighting for the right to be heard.